The nuclear precipice. How are you finding it so far?
I remember when there used to be that, like, doomsday clock that everyone focused on about how close we were to nuclear annihilation. And I think that so many of the usual suspects have been focused on climate Armageddon. They just, like, don't care about nuclear Armageddon anymore. I mean, that thing should be like 5 seconds to midnight now, and no one cares about it.
No, I think I saw another smarty pants from some American think tank say there's actually a 1 in 6 chance of nuclear war now. Which they all seem fairly relaxed. I mean, I can understand. I guess that's about, what is that, the same odds as the Pfizer vaccine these days? I don't know. 1 in 6 chance of nuclear war. Everybody's talking about this as if talking about nuclear Armageddon, as Joe Biden was doing, at a fundraiser, because it's good for his business model. Everybody has somehow internalized this idea that talking about nuclear Armageddon is kind of normal now.
It's the epitome of denial. And I mean, if you even listen to the White House, they have their president talking about nuclear Armageddon, but then they're saying, well, no, we're not changing our nuclear posture. Everything's fine. Everything's the same. The whole premise of mutually assured destruction was that Russia fires a nuke and then the United States fires a nuke back. They're talking about public relations nuclear annihilation, and the embarrassment of nuking the world is going to be what defeats Russia, which is not exactly how I remember the MAD scenarios playing out.
No, this is actually nuttier than anything in Dr. Strangelove. They're saying, aha, so we're going to let Putin go ahead and nuke Ukraine because he'll never be able to cope with the bad press.
But just a little nuke. That's what in that interview you were saying. Just a little tiny nuke in Ukraine. If he does a little nuke. So when this eventually happens, if the horrible does happen, the U.S. will be measuring the size of the nuke to determine whether letting it go and just sort of finger wagging is a sufficient enough response.
Yeah, I don't think it will be, actually. I don't think... well, let me ask you this, because we've had this since day one of the war. They were showing these pictures of Putin looking puffy face. He's a very sick man. He's obviously bonkers. He's nuts. I notice these days, I was just tootling along listening to the BBC. That was my first mistake. And they had a feature on how, you know, Kanye West, who'd said something they didn't like, so he must be mentally ill. Who would you think is nuttier here? Putin, who's waging a vicious, brutal, old-fashioned war, or these guys in Washington who are saying, yeah, I think we should just let him loose off a small nuke, and that'll be his big mistake. Who's the nuttier here?
Yeah, I mean, the armchair psychiatry about Vladimir Putin, I note, is never directed to Joe Biden, which I think is their first mistake. But I also...
Well, because, you know, if you're trying to read someone's mind, the guy has to have a mind.
Well, yes, that is
so
true.
He doesn't meet the minimum criterion there.
But it is baffling to me that this has been, as you mentioned, normalized, and everyone accepts that this is just the standard order of things. And when you hear former generals talking about outsmarting Putin by doing nothing, as though that's really going to throw him off his game, you have to wonder who's in charge. But then you look at Afghanistan, and nothing seems all that surprising.
Well, that's a very good point. We saw the nation that accounts for 40% of global military spending lose to goat herds with fertilizer. And yes, it's true that the British and NATO were in that and own that defeat as well. But basically, the Americans ran that war and they lost that war. I mean, why should we think they'd be any better at winning a nuclear war?
Well, absolutely. And I mean, you go back to 2012 and Mitt Romney was mocked for talking about things that everyone said belonged in the Cold War. And I think there's been such a desire to move beyond that people forget some of those dynamics are still very much alive and well today.
Yeah, I mean, that's the famous moment in the debate when Romney brought up Russia and Obama sneered, oh, the 1980s just called, they'd like their foreign policy back. Why do you think the left, this determination, well, this transformation of Putin, who is certainly a thug and he's certainly a bloodthirsty thug, but why the need to turn him into a cartoon villain who's behind everything? He was apparently running the Trump White House. Then Trump managed to get out of the White House, so then he moved on to threatening nuclear war. Why what have we done to Putin that to make him into this cartoon villain here?
I think the left has been fighting for years this idea that there are enemies in other countries. I mean, the left has tried to make its primary enemy the one within. They've tried to make their primary villains the right.
Yeah.
And I think that right now, when you do have a real villain, they've done so much to neuter that narrative because it would prove they were wrong all those years about foreign policy.
Yeah, that's true, actually. The whole thing with foreign policy and the left is that there are no enemies, just friends whose grievances we haven't yet accommodated. And that's true whether it's fire-breathing Ayatollahs or the Chinese Communist Party. So the demonization of Putin is odd here. Do you actually think, I mean, a 1 in 6 chance of nuclear war, if you'd said to somebody in July 1914, anywhere in the Habsburg Empire, there's a 1 in 6 chance of a world war that will leave millions dead, people would have thought you were ridiculous, but it happened the following month. Why do you think there's a real danger of this?
I think there is a danger, and certainly I don't think that the United States response is helping matters. But I think a lot of the time there's been so much of an emphasis on these dozens and dozens of denuclearization treaties that have taken place over the last 40, 50 years, and few people have looked at the underlying thing. And when everyone is in agreement about what's going to happen, these things are fantastic. But Russia was a part of those discussions as well, and where has it gotten us?